Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And if you'll, obviously today's webinar is on the management of today's challenges in terms of supply chain risk. We want to thank everyone who's attending and want to give you some additional information about who the District Export Council is and who the Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions, who's one of our sponsors. Okay, well, we seem to be having some problems with our initial slides, and I guess I'll start without it. The District Export Council is part of a national trade promotion organization, and there are 60 district export councils whose mission is to help mentor companies and to help them with training on various levels of information pertaining to exporting and to provide mentorship as well and guidance. And we will also help with trying to set trade policy with the government and helping them by giving them information on what's important to exporters in the United States. The Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions is our major sponsor, and their mission is to assist manufacturers to maximize enterprise value by helping them with innovation, operational excellence, sustainability, and leadership development. And as we were indicating a little while ago, we try to help individual companies to strengthen their ability to export. Our speaker today is going to be Ms. Beth Cook, who is the Director of Customer Success at Resilinc, a company that is headquartered in California. Beth is responsible for working with the company's largest biotech and automotive customers, helping them leverage the monitoring, mapping, and risk assessment programs in order to achieve supply chain resiliency. And she's been with the company now for a little while, and she's been a real pleasure to work with.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Okay. All righty. Well, very good. Ahead. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, technology is wonderful until it doesn't work, right?
You know what? I think that's pretty commonplace. But I think I read somewhere that the number one saying is, turn your camera on, or you're on mute if you're trying to talk, we can't hear you. So, or my personal favorite is, can you see my screen? I think you can't have a meeting without one of those three things.
Absolutely.
So again, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just want to thank you for being with us, and we're going to kind of cover 4 major topics, and there'll be, I'm sure, spin-offs as we discuss those things. We're going to be talking about the current state of supply chain, lessons learned from the trenches, technology-based supply chain monitoring and mapping solutions, and the case for supply chain risk management in the new normal. Also want to make sure that everyone knows that you have the ability to put questions or ask questions in the chat section of the website there. Please feel free to ask questions. We will be handling them at the very end, but please feel free to submit whatever questions you do have. And so, Ms. Beth, why don't you start talking to us about what you're seeing via this slide here in terms of the current state of supply chain?
Sure, absolutely. So what we're looking at here is kind of what we have seen in the first half of 2021. So everything we're looking at are events that have happened from January 1st to the end of June. And what we're seeing is, we're seeing that there's a total of about 5,425 event type news articles that are out there. And that would be anything that you see on the media today, in newspapers, online, anything from Twitter to, the Wall Street Journal to local and more localized newspapers and town newspapers or country newspapers, those types of things. So what we're go ahead. Sorry.
So Beth, just to make sure that I understand, what you're saying here is that there are that many articles and comments you made in the news media pertaining specifically to supply chain issues. Is that correct?
Correct. So these would be things that could potentially impact your supply chain. So that's everything from, man-made disruptions, factory fires, natural disaster type events like hurricanes and earthquakes to, business and mergers and acquisitions, leadership changes, all the way down to supply chains or supply shortages, part shortages, and even some commodity level type scarcity. So yeah, so we're looking at, like I said, it's about 5,425 is what we've seen. And that averages to about 30 types a day, which is quite a bit when you think about it. And what we'll do kind of further on down here is I'll actually kind of explain the increases that we've been seeing between 2019 and 2021. Of those articles or those news events that we've captured, we've actually found that 59% of them have had potential direct impacts to our client supply chains. Which is pretty big. So out of everything that we have seen, everything that you see on the news and in the, in the media in any way, about 59% of them actually do have the potential to directly impact your supply chain, which is pretty powerful, and it's up from what we have seen kind of in previous years. I know there's been a lot of talk about COVID and, some of the things that it's caused, like port congestion, delays, labor shortages, a bunch of different things that we'll kind of talk about as well. But what we've actually found is the top type of events in the first half of the year have been related to factory fires and disruptions, mergers, acquisitions, business sales, and leadership changes. Of those, the three industries that we're seeing kind of affected the most are life sciences, healthcare, and auto. And then with all the news that we've been seeing with the media around, the Southeast Asia issues, the Malaysia lockdowns, I think we would have thought that a majority of these types of events would have happened in kind of, the Asia or the APAC territory, but really we're seeing a majority of them in North America and Europe. Some of the things that we're seeing in general around factory fires actually is related to COVID in some way. So what we're looking at there are things like the lockdowns kind of had limited the availability of kind of the skilled workers. Social distancing rules have also forced managers to kind of operate with fewer staff. And then we've also seen things like, because the factories were not forced, but they switched the type of things that they were making. So they switched from, I think it was from whatever they were making before to some of them started making PPE equipment, hand sanitizer, that type of thing. So having these workers handle substances that they're not used to or have not, typically done has also been one of those things that we found has contributed to some of the factory fires. We're also seeing in terms of mergers and acquisitions, that's something that we usually do see kind of in Q4, the end of the year. But we're seeing an uptick in them in the first half of the year, and we believe that that's because, that we've seen shortage around the business and leadership transitions because of rising from pandemics, how it's kind of forced industries to either make changes and switch gears in what they've been doing, but it's also kind of allowed or kind of have made so that there's been a lot, they're merging with other companies to increase their product line and their, they're getting their foots in, different types of products to diversify a little bit better. So that's kind of what we're seeing in terms of what's kind of causing these types of events to be higher than what, we have seen in the past.
Beth, one of the things this highlights for me something that in talking to some of my supply chain colleagues, that in many cases, one of the things that happens is that we ask our clients, so where are you getting your supplies from, your materials from, your parts from? And in many cases, they think they're getting it from some guy in California, and they are, but the reality is that person or that company is getting stuff from Sri Lanka or Germany or some other place. The California is not the source for the product, and so obviously, given what you're seeing here, an event in Sri Lanka or Germany or any other place could have a significant impact in the ability of the guy in California to get the materials that he normally sells to you. So there's a very significant tie in terms of, just as it says, the supply chain, right? It's not one single source, but everything is made from different components throughout the world. And every one of these events that you're describing here can significantly impact your business. As a matter of fact, not just in Arkansas, but across the country, one of the things that we're seeing that is that companies that did not really take into account, did not understand their supply chain, did not understand that really the product does not come from California, wound up going out of business. So understanding your supply chain and the different factors that impact it are critically important, not only to the success of the company, but to the very survival of the company.
No, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the things we'll get into maybe a little bit deeper in the lessons learned. But when you take into, the factory fire was one of the indications that led to the semiconductor shortage. Not the only thing, but it definitely put into it. And a lot of things that we were seeing around the Texas freeze that had a pretty big disruption in the packaging industry. So, your supplier, might not have thought your supplier was affected, but if your supplier was, purchasing these packaging materials kind of from their supplier, that ultimately is part of your ecosystem. And so you're seeing delays from your primary supplier because there's delays in the suppliers who are supplying them for these parts.
Absolutely. This might actually be a good time to take a poll. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and see if what the answers to some of the people who are attending the webinar, how they comment in terms of some of these poll questions.
Yeah.
And this obviously is interactive, so feel free to comment. Okay, well, this is interesting. As you can see, and that this is the part that's extremely telling, is that 0% of the people who are attending the webinar said that there was no impact to their supply chain. 9% said a little bit, and as you can see the results here, from causing some pretty good problems to extreme difficulty. So basically 91% of the attendees of the webinar said that things got really difficult to extremely difficult. So that's very, very telling. All right, let's go ahead and get back to the other one. All right.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. So what we're looking at here is just kind of a breakdown of the numbers that we saw on the previous screen. So now we're looking at kind of by industry and region and the different kind of event types that we monitor. So by industry, what we're looking at here for life sciences, it's saying that out of all of the news that we've seen, the different news articles and media and all of that, about 63% of them actually had potential to impact your supply chain. Which is pretty powerful, right? So the average was 59, but with her life sciences specifically, it's 63%. When you look at healthcare, it's 61%, and automotive is 55%. And a lot of that has to do with, the semiconductor shortages and some of the plastics delays that we've seen with that.
Well, as a matter of fact, Beth, I want to comment on the
Okay.
semiconductor. You guys may have noticed that car sales, or I should say the pricing on cars has gone up. And in particular, what has gone up is the pricing on used cars. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the automakers were unable to get the semiconductors that they use that they install in their vehicles, i.e., they were unable to finish the production of new vehicles. And so the only thing that was available for a while, or to a significant degree, was used cars. And so, the demand on used cars was great, and so the prices went up.
Yeah, absolutely. And that has to do also with the semiconductors. But again, as we mentioned, it's also kind of a delay in the plastics as well.
For sure.
So that's definitely been a huge one. And as you know, semiconductors are in just about everything these days. So it's caused a significant increase or decrease or delay in not just automotives, but, phones and electronics and that type of thing. So it's been pretty interesting. There's a lot of things there are a lot more things on back order and, not available kind of online or in stores that there used to be because of that. In terms of kind of by region, we talked about earlier about North America and Europe. So, but the top three are North America, Europe, and Asia. So when you're looking at North America, 68% of the different types of news events that you're seeing actually had a potential impact to the supply chain, whereas Europe, it was 61% and Asia was about 41%. So this just kind of breaks down the numbers a little bit more. But what I think you'll find really impactful, which is kind of one of the, it was eye-opening for me, is we talked a little bit earlier around kind of the top 5 different types of events that we're seeing around factory fires and disruptions, mergers and acquisitions, business sales, those type of things. But what I really want to showcase here is how much they've increased. So what you're looking at here in the kind of that darker orange bar is the total number of incidents in 2021, and the kind of lighter yellow bar is 2020. I'm sorry, orange was 2020, kind of yellow is 2021. So from 2019 to 2020, we saw about a 22% increase in factory fire type events. But when you look at 2021, it's 152% increase. So that's that's a really significant increase, and that has helped kind of an indicator to start looking at, not only do you need to start mapping your supply chain, but so you don't necessarily just have to worry about where they are geographically for natural type events or geopolitical events, but you also need to start knowing some of their business practices and the safety nets they put in place. Like, it would be very good to know.
Like cybersecurity, for instance?
Yep, that is definitely one of them. But for factory fires specifically, you want to know whether or not your suppliers have fire suppression systems in their factories. And that's something that, you can reach out, through either, business continuity plans or specific assessments to be able to see whether they have those or not. And if they don't, that's a pretty big flag. So we've seen clients where their suppliers don't have them, and they've kind of worked with them to be able to make sure that they get those in place, or find alternative sites, or even in some cases alternative suppliers that do have those types of things.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that kind of getting back to the deal about California, a lot of people think that, well, if Bob in California goes out of business, I'll just get somebody else. And not understanding that even if they're able to do that, the timeline in which they can get somebody else and make sure that the product is up to par could be 5-6 months. It could take a really long time. And I think that most companies don't understand that their very survival is dependent on their suppliers. And if for whatever reason, whether the owner of the business goes out of business because of bad business practices, because he didn't have fire suppression, any number of things that could impact the supplier could in fact put you out of business if you haven't made arrangements, don't understand who the other suppliers are, haven't made those arrangements. And so there's a lot more to supply chain management than just knowing that you can buy stuff from Bob in California. Things that could actually impact your company to an extreme degree.
Absolutely. And even if, just to take your example, even if it's Bob in California that has the factory fire, depending on, the level of damage, does that mean, how long is it going to take Bob to, set up your manufacturing in one of his alternate sites? Does Bob have an alternate site? If he doesn't, and Bob's the only one you're getting your most critical component for, then that's something that you want to take a deeper dive into as well.
For sure. One of the things that I hear from companies that I talk to about supply chain, and they tell me, well, I only have one supplier. Well, why do you do that? Well, it's because the more I buy from one supplier, the bigger the discount I get, and I understand that. But what they're kind of playing with, kind of put a pun, they're playing with fire, right? They're playing with fire because the reality is, while having multiple suppliers may cause your pricing to go up. Let's say on the second supplier, it may be 5% more because the volume that you're buying from that one supplier is lower. The reality is that if you lose your supplier, once again, just to go over it, is that it could just impact you dramatically. And so it's much better to have multiple suppliers, so that if you are already buying from supplier B, well, obviously that supplier B, in fact, can produce the product, materials, supplies, widgets, whatever it is. You already know that they can, in fact, produce them to the quality that you're needing, because they're already doing it. And the ability to switch from supplier A to supplier B, should you need to, the transition is going to be much, much quicker. Whereas if you're having to look for a new supplier and then have to vet them out, and then they have to produce stuff, and it's just an iterative process. And once again, it could take months and months before you get the product the way that you want it. And in that time period, you could be out of business. So even though you might have a slight price increase by not buying as much from A because you're also buying from B, it's about risk mitigation. It's about making sure that you can continue the operation of your company.
That's correct, and that's actually one of the leading risk indicators that Resilinc tracks. It's where you're sourcing your parts from. Is it a sole source, meaning you have this is the only supplier in the world that you can get it from because they're making something extremely customized for you, or is it single sourced where you do have other options, but you're choosing to, for whatever reason, just getting it from that one supplier. And then there's multi-source, which we even actually break down to, how much are you getting from one supplier versus the other from a percentage, right? So if it's 20% from, one supplier and 80% from other, that's still pretty, that still represents kind of its own, a decent amount of risk, right? But if it's 50-50, or if it's split more 60-40, 70-30, those types of things, that would kind of decrease your risk a little bit. So that is something that we work with our clients on pretty regularly, which is, let's take a look at your parts and let's identify if you have alternate suppliers. And if you do, we can actually track that in our tool as well. But we also kind of will show, bring up time and how long it'll take for you to move from, because even if you have an alternate site available, it's still going to take them time to, kind of bring up the manufacturing line in that new site if it isn't already there. So there's a few different things that we kind of look at and try to help our, steer our clients to based off of, the risk that we're seeing based off of, where they're part sourcing from.
Excellent. Now, Beth, is this another good time to take a second poll? It'll be the last poll.
Sure.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Give us a minute here to ramp that up. Okay. Have you used technology-based monitoring and mapping solutions at this time or already? Okay. I suspect that by now if everybody's answered the yes or no question. And let's see what the results are. And it'll be a nice segue to the next section.
Yeah.
Okay, so it says here that 21% of the companies who are attending the webinar right now have indicated that they use some sort of technology-based monitoring and mapping solution, and 79% don't. So this might be a good time to discuss those technologies.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So, good.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead and just go ahead? I think we're done with this slide. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we're done.
Very good. Okay. We'll switch out of that.
All right. Oops, let me go ahead and.
Yeah, there we go. All right.
Okay, there we go. So now you don't have to see us twice. Yeah, so I thought what we would do now, this might be a good way to, we'll get into the different types of technologies that are out there to map your supply chain. But before we do that, I kind of just wanted to jump into some of the lessons we've learned this year, because I think that ties into the different types of technologies that you can have to kind of mitigate that. So there's been quite a few lessons this year, as I'm sure you guys all aware. You've all learned your own as well. But one of the top ones we're seeing is the through that, you need to know who your sub-tier suppliers are, right? So it's no longer just good enough to know who your tier 1 suppliers are, or Bob in California is kind of we've been using as an example. You really do need to understand your entire supplier ecosystem. And one of those examples was with the Texas freeze. So with the Texas freeze, and there was a hurricane that went through Texas and Louisiana, and then the Texas freeze, and a lot of that impacted kind of the resins in the plastic industry. So there were a lot of delays and a lot of shortages in all kinds of different industries that some of our clients were caught, or some clients were caught unaware, because they weren't buying packaging materials. They were getting all of that from their supplier, but their supplier was actually purchasing from one of these factories or one of these companies that were in this area, and then that was shut down. or there was a huge delay. So there was actually a downstream effect with your product because your supplier couldn't ship or couldn't manufacture or get your product to you because they were waiting on their sub tiers. So it's a really good thing to know, like I said, not just who your suppliers are, but who your suppliers are, or in some cases who your suppliers are. And so that's a pretty good case in general for mapping your supply chain down to kind of the nth tier so that you can catch these types of things when they happen. Another one, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, kind of anecdotally, you may remember, I don't know, maybe it was 5-6 years ago, that there was this big typhoon in Japan, and it brought down this nuclear power plant. And as it turns out, amongst the companies that were impacted by that, and they were shut down for a really long time, because apparently the nuclear power plant generation was flooded as the seas came in and whatnot. And so there were a lot of companies that were making black paint for Toyota and several other of the other Japanese manufacturers. And for probably 6 months or so, you could buy any car, any Toyota you wanted, so long as it was not black, because there was no black paint to be had. So once again, it gets back to understanding downstream, who your suppliers are and what could impact them, like this nuclear power plant being shut down.
Yeah. And we've seen kind of a similar example with the drought in Taiwan that happened earlier this year, that made the news, as kind of a human interest in, what's going around the world story. But really, because a majority of, at least 80% of the semiconductor fabrication and testing is done in the Southeast Asia area, and a majority of it is in Taiwan itself, that caused a lot of issues too. So you were seeing reported on it for one way and may not have necessarily understood that, or kind of made the connection that it was actually impacting supply chains as well. Specifically, if you're getting these types of things from a sub-tier supplier and you're not aware of them. Kind of one of the other things that we've, I don't want to say this is that we've learned, but it was kind of a lessons learned from a specific client. So one of our clients is a truck manufacturer that has their factories kind of in Ohio and Illinois and Michigan. And so their procurement that was sitting in those factories were buying products and supplies from both regular suppliers and sub-tier suppliers from companies that were in the Southeast. And when kind of the headquarters risk program kind of procurement didn't necessarily know where these parts were coming from. So when a potential, hurricane path came, or one of these kind of areas was actually hit by a hurricane, the procurement folks that were sitting in, the factories kind of in the Midwest were reaching out, trying to see if they could figure out if, how can you help us get these parts? What can we do? What are our options? And there wasn't a whole lot of room to be able to kind of proactively mitigate that because they didn't know. So one of the things that they did was, they kind of started setting up their own SCRM program, which included risk. And one of the first things they did was map these parts. So where are they coming from that are going into, your products in these manufacturers? And they did find that a lot of them were, in, Florida and Texas, Louisiana, those types of things. So using our tool, they were actually able to map their supply chain so they could see geographically, kind of geographically where everything stood. But using the Event Watch and our 24/7 monitoring, they were actually able to see, okay, here's the potential hurricane path for, I don't know, we'll call it Hurricane A or Hurricane Leo. And here are the potential suppliers and sites that are affected. Here are the parts that are manufactured in these sites. Here are the parts that these go into for your products. So here's your potential revenue loss. And they could see all of that fairly quickly once that warning was done. So they were able to, kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit and, and try to find either alternate or make kind of other plans. The other thing that they did kind of once they got that in place is they started running simulation exercises or tabletop exercises. I've kind of heard them that term in different ways, but they started running those in February and March. So it was, what happens if a hurricane, takes a track and hits, East Texas, or, goes up through Louisiana, or, goes through Puerto Rico, kind of like Hurricane Maria did quite a few years ago, that caused a lot of damage. So they were able to get ahead of it and figure out who could potentially be impacted. So they were able to start mitigating that risk much, much earlier than their competitors would, based off of that. So I think that's kind of another lessons learned in general for why it's so important to know where your parts are coming from and where your suppliers are located.
One of the things that you and I talked about previously was the case where it turns out that one company supplies certain components to 5 or 6 other major suppliers, and of course, if that one source for those 5 major distributors as well, if they go down, well, then of course it affects all the distribution companies that are providing that materials or supplies or whatever.
Yeah, nope, that is correct. So that is another thing that we see as well, and it's another reason why knowing who your sub-tier suppliers are so important, because you might have 5 suppliers that are getting their supplies from the same supplier,
So,
so like a sub-tier supplier. And if something goes wrong with that sub-tier supplier, then it's not only it could potentially be affecting more parts and more suppliers than what you're aware of. So that's another, like, that's a good example of another reason why you should know not just who your main suppliers are, but your entire supplier ecosystem.
great.
I think another one in general that's been pretty big this year, started last year, is cybersecurity, right? So cybersecurity, it's become obviously a lot more mainstream now with the SolarWinds attacks, with the pipeline attack, and JBS beef, and there's been quite a few different companies who've had experienced cybersecurity issues, and in general, and me too, up in when we don't really think it through. Cybersecurity is always kind of not limited, but it just kind of assumed it's an IT problem, right? It's our IT system, that department that puts up our firewalls, that makes sure that our threats are mitigated and all of that. But it's actually really a supply chain problem as well, because 80% of 80% of cyber attacks actually come from your suppliers. And if your suppliers have your data, your information, it's very easy for them to get yours as well if that particular supplier has an issue.
So Beth, just to make sure that I understand, it's not that your suppliers are hacking you, but that they are being hacked, and consequently, uh, the hackers are getting your information and getting to you through them. Do I understand that correctly?
Correct. So, you can take example like a phishing scam. So, one phishing email could have one employee who goes in and clicks on it, and now all of a sudden they're able to get that employee's information. So they're able to get their users and passwords, or that type of thing, and then they can get into the system, and then that grows. When we look at the SolarWinds attack, it actually affected a majority of their clients, because they weren't aware at the time that it happened, and so they ended up passing it to a very large number of their clients who use them, including some top technology companies, some government. So it became a very, I think it put that much more mainstream. But it is, I think the main takeaway of that is, it's not just an IT problem, it's a supply chain problem. So, not only do you need to know where your suppliers are located geographically, and who's supplying your sub-tier suppliers and all of that, but you also need to take a look at what their business practices are, right? You
Yeah,
want to know what their cybersecurity is.
yeah, and that kind of goes back to the concept of resilience. You were mentioning that it looks like it's an IT problem, but it's really a supply chain problem as well. And I think that one of the things that COVID and other things that have occurred in the recent past is that there are so many things that one has to pay attention to, that if
Hmm.
you only focus on one thing, for instance, you might have your supply chain fully mapped out and you're monitoring it and all of that, and you think you're good, but if you're not paying attention to cybersecurity, your company could be impacted that way as well. Any number of risk mitigation practices that one needs to look at to make sure that their company is resilient and able to overcome almost any difficulty that occurs. So I think the way that we need to look at things as opposed to the way that in the past that we've looked at very in a silo fashion, right? But I think that business managers and especially upper management needs to look at the risk picture much more broadly, because any one of those things can take them down.
Exactly. And it's, you're right, it is much more broadly. So cybersecurity is the big one, but so is business continuity plans. We talked about, the number of factory fires that were out there. So you do need to know kind of what their continuity plan is. If there is a factory fire, do they have a fire suppression system? Another topic that's been, kind of growing in popularity is, corporate responsibility, sustainability, human health rights, child labor laws, all of those different things that, your company might have their own practices, but if yours aren't in line with your suppliers, or your suppliers don't have those practices, those kind of fall on you as well. So those are types of things, right? So, today's consumer in general, and they're not just looking at who's got the best price or what's the most availability. Why that is still very much, that's still, very important and very, one of the main factors. You also now have to start to, look at some of the other things as well, because that could reflect, poorly on you if your suppliers aren't following these types of practices.
For sure. Okay. Do you want to go ahead and move on to the technology-based supply chain monitoring and mapping solutions?
Sure. So I think we
Okay.
talked about, in general, some of the lessons learned, and there's a lot of different types of supply chain solutions out there, right? There's just strain inventory management that can, and logistics management that can, track packages and parts from one place to another. And then there's kind of the more encompassing part, which, is one of the things that that Resilinc does. We have kind of multiple modules, but there's software out there where you can map your supply chain, so you can visually, geographically see where everything is located, and then you can as well kind of take that and then kind of run it up against the events that are happening. So you 24/7 event monitoring. So not only do you know where your suppliers are, you know the events that are potentially affecting them. If you start with your suppliers, but you don't know who your sub-tier suppliers are, then there's the ability to go out, reach out and survey your suppliers. So that could be something that your team does internally via spreadsheet or a phone call or an email or something. But Resilinc has tools out there where we can supply them for you. We call them assessments or surveys, but we can actually reach out to your suppliers directly and say, here are the parts that we think that you have, and then they will say, say these are the parts, these are our part numbers if they have a different number, but that they can also go in and tell which one of those parts are coming from their sub-tier suppliers and tell you who their sub-tier suppliers are as well. So that aids to the overall picture. The other thing we talked about too is the importance of cybersecurity and business continuity plans and corporate sustainability. So those other assessments out there that you can do that will kind of rate your suppliers on that. So now, and kind of give you an overall score. So now you're looking at a larger picture than just what you saw with the geographical mapping. You can now see things like how susceptible are they to a natural disaster. They're in Puerto Rico, they're probably going to get, they have a higher level of rate of possibility of getting a hurricane than, maybe somebody in Montana, or, if you're in, Japan, you probably have a higher level of getting an earthquake than someplace else. So you can have those types of risk scores, but then you can also get some of the other ones, which are, maybe some of your internal KPIs as well, the quality of the product, on-time delivery, that type of thing, but also the financial, wealth of the company, and or health of the company is what I meant. What are their business practices? Do you think that are there things in the news about them, reporting quarters losses or losses that quarter, that type of thing. So there are different ways to be able to get kind of that more holistic view of your supply chain, and not just necessarily how much inventory you have sitting in one factory or kind of on the move, or how it's moving, but just overall how you're being able to see all of that in one place.
That's great. This might be, I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I'd like us to talk about, I guess the case that's to be made for supply chain risk management, right?
Mm-hmm.
And given everything that we've seen, and you know, I wish I could say that I had some sort of crystal ball that would tell us how things are going in the future. And you know, when COVID first hit, my bosses asked me, so what's likely to happen in terms of supply chain? And I told them, well, I think XYZ is going to happen, and it was pretty accurate. What I did not foresee is that a year later, as the graph very clearly showed, that the impacts are actually greater now than they were a year ago. And so this new normal is not just in COVID, but the lessons that we've learned about the fact that you've got to pay attention to all of this, and that just looking at one side of it and just looking at where you can get the cheapest price, it's not going to cut anymore. You really have to look at your suppliers as partners that your company's life depends on. And so
Right.
if you can comment about that, I would appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. So, kind of want to give you an example that might help with this too, and then we'll kind of go into kind of more of the case and where to start if you don't have one in place yet. But there is a life science manufacturer that had one of its major manufacturing factories in Puerto Rico. When Hurricane Maria came through and devastated Puerto Rico, they were majorly impacted. I'm not sure if you knew, but I found this surprising. 10% of the drugs that or the medicines that are prescribed or used in the U.S. are actually manufactured in Puerto Rico. But this particular manufacturer had some issues because their factory was it was pretty much shut down because of the damage and all the different things that happened. And kind of the downstream effect with that is they actually had a $270 million loss for one quarter, which is
Whoa.
huge. That is absolutely huge. But one of the other things that came out of that as well was a lower NPS score, which is kind of the net promoter score, which is how likely your clients are to buy from you again or also recommend you to other people. And with that being lower, you know, the impacts of that are much larger and far reaching than just that one quarter loss. So there's a lot of kind of takeaways from that is, you know, when you have supply chain disruptions or when you have delays in getting things, yes, it's not great, or you know it's a delay. You know, maybe you're taking a financial loss, but what you might not be looking at is, you know, what are the other downstream effects are from your clients in general. Does that mean, you know, if you are their sole provider for a part and they've chosen just to purchase from you, you know, we'll take Bob from California again. If Bob from California isn't able to produce or has a major delay and that impacts you directly, how likely are you to purchase from Bob again? Or, you know, how likely are you want to diversify and maybe find a Frank who, you know, is in Oregon or something along those lines. So those are other things that, you know, are a little less tangible, but are absolutely cases for understanding your supply chain better, and not only just understanding it, but be able to understand the different types of risks, to be able to forecast and simulate, run tabletop exercises, to be able to, you know, mitigate the risk before it happens, if you will, to be able to help with some of that. So, go ahead. I thought you were
Yeah,
going to
I
say
was
something.
just going to say that you know, we talked about Bob in California, and the fact that you know, looking at him and you as a buyer from Bob, you know, how likely are you to buy from him because he can't provide the product anymore. But you're being looked at as well, right? Your clients
Hmm.
are looking at well, I mean, they don't really know about Bob, right? And actually, they don't care about Bob. What they care about is that you no longer can provide them with X. And so how is that going to impact your company's viability? I mean, your clients they have choices in most cases, and if you know you're being looked at, your company's being looked at, and the fact that Bob is you know, not able to produce is not what they care about. You know, that's not who they're buying from. They're buying from you. And so whether it's customer service in terms of, you know, how do you treat your clients, to can you be counted on to be able to provide X? Those are things that the consumers, whether they're companies or individuals, are looking at in terms of your company.
Exactly. I know we had talked about kind of the new normal, and I kind of chuckle when I hear that because I feel like there is no new normal. Whatever the new normal is kind of what you're experiencing today. So your supply chain program, in order to be resilient, you have to not only kind of have that set up, but it's a continuous process. Things are constantly changing. Your suppliers, could be purchased, changing who their suppliers are. There could be kind of a new wave of cybersecurity attacks, or whatever that new next thing is that you now need to be able to monitor your clients for. And I think one of the bigger takeaways in general is to have a resilient program, right? It's people, processes, and technology. But it's also, I think it used to be not typically, that's not the right word, but you would see supply chain more as an inventory level management, or procurement, or those types of things. But really, with the different types of things we're seeing, you actually need to have more people involved in that, right? So you'll need finance, especially if something happens and now you need to secure, purchase products from a different company, because poor Bob in California. I hope there isn't a Bob in California who actually owns a company. Because, and okay, Bob from California, if you're on, sorry, it was just a random name pick. But so you need finances buy-in to be able to secure the additional funds to purchase things. You want R&D is going to need to know who your kind of preferred suppliers are, or kind of their practices, while they're designing products. If they're designing products with specific parts from a company, and that company later down the line has issues, then your new product launch could potentially have issues. So it's really no longer just kind of a procurement or an inventory level function. It's really an entire company function. I mean, even marketing, down to the fact that we had talked about the brand image, the potential damage to brand images. So when you're setting up these programs, it's important to understand who your stakeholders are, in terms of your company, and kind of what you would need and who you would need support from. Some companies have a separate risk program completely that will start handling kind of the immediate triage of some of these events and risks, but they always reach out to the commodity managers, or the buyers, or finance, or the marketing team, depending on what it is. If you found that one of your suppliers has a human rights violation, then that's something that your marketing department is probably want to try to get ahead of. So I think I feel like I'm saying the same thing over again, but the end of the day, you can't just look at supply chain risk and to have a resilient program. You do really need to have multiple stakeholders involved, and get their buy-in and their improvement. But you also tend to have multiple internal tools. You have your ERP system, or your order management system, and your inventory system, and in some cases companies have multiple of those, if through acquisitions or something. So you need to know who you need to go to be able to even figure out what suppliers that you have, or what parts are coming from where. And sometimes that's a much larger job than what it sounds like. Because I think sometimes it sounds like, oh, I can give you a list of our suppliers and I can tell you what parts we get from them. And then you actually go in and try to do that exercise, and you realize, oh, okay, well, this one's coming from Oracle, and this one's coming from our internal house order management system that we originally had, and this one's coming from this inventory management from this factory, and this one. So it's not only the stakeholders in terms of the different departments and functionalities, but it's also where you're getting the data from. Tends to be kind of a large undertaking in and of itself. So those are the different types of things that you think about, or that you want to take into account when you're setting up these programs. So if you currently have one in place, that's great. I think the takeaway here is just to make sure that it's continually evolving. If what you have in place now was based off of data you had a year ago, it's very possible that that's changed. Either they discontinued one part, so you're buying another one that's similar, and but maybe coming from a different site that you're not aware of, or your suppliers have changed their sub-tier suppliers, that type of thing. And also starting to take into account cybersecurity practices, or your supplier practices. Some of our some clients even implement kind of their own supplier scorecard. So where your and procurement or risk are kind of getting together and giving your supplier a score, and some of that stuff is also ends up being used in the contract negotiations and things like that. If you don't have a supply chain program now, or you're kind of contemplating how to get it started, I guess that the advice that we have would be start with what you have. Start with the suppliers that you have that are supplying to you, and then build from there. If it's still that seems kind of like a large undertaking, because it very well could be, then narrow it down to what's the most impactful, right? So maybe you start with your suppliers that are 80% of your spend. And start with those. And once you get those mapped, well, then let's start looking at either your indirect suppliers or, some of your other suppliers. And once you have, your tier one suppliers, then, you can use assessments, or you can reach out and kind of have them help you with some of the work for, mapping your sub-tier suppliers.
Yeah.
And then
Beth,
also,
I was just going to say, I'm going to want to go to the question in just a second here, but
okay.
I think kind of at the end of the day, what I think what you've been saying, very very thoroughly here, is that it's a different world in terms of what we've learned. The worst case scenarios have in fact come about, things that we never expected to come out. And the one thing that is the major takeaway here, I think, from this webinar and just from supply chain risk management, is that you have to be look at things much more holistically, much less siloed, and look at every aspect of your business if your business is to survive. Would you say so?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. I think that sums that up pretty nicely, and a
Yeah.
lot more eloquently than I probably have done. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, let me see here. I've got a question here. How open are these suppliers to provide information on sub-tier suppliers and their cybersecurity procedures? That's a great question.
That is a great question, and it kind of depends on a couple things. So we have found suppliers that are pretty open to giving that information. And sometimes it's written into kind of their procurement contracts that they have to give you that information. For the ones that aren't really all that susceptible to it, then it comes down to sometimes from when we have that challenge at Resilinc, we put in non-disclosure agreements and that type of thing with that supplier, so that they are more willing to give the sub-tier information.
That's great.
Same with cybersecurity as well.
Perfect. Now, hopefully, you guys, my screen is actually frozen. Hopefully, you're not seeing that at this point. That's what happens when you click things that you're not supposed to. But in any case, I want to thank you very much, Beth, for taking time to talk to us about the risk mitigation part of supply chain, and looking at things holistically, and giving us the stats that are insightful in terms of how things are working and not working, and the effects of the changes that are occurring. I think that one of the things that people really need to look at is continue scanning the environment on a daily basis, because you were saying a little while ago, Beth, that this concept of the new normal. Well, things are always changing, but I think it's fair to say that things seem to be changing faster than they ever have before. That you just the amount of, not just the amount of change that's occurring, but the accelerated pace in which things are changing. And I don't think that we can any longer think that we could have a business plan, for instance, or a business strategy, and you kind of dust it off every 5 years, and not look at not look at the plan and all the variables within your company and what's important and impactful, as you put it, in your company. This is something that needs to be looked at frequently, constantly scanning the environment to see what things are out there that could provide either an opportunity or a catastrophe for your company. And so I think that's one of the things that we all need to pay attention to, and certainly supply chain management and resilience in its holistic meaning is something that we definitely need to pay attention to. And I think, Beth, do you have any last comment?
I don't think so. I think you summed it up pretty well. If anyone does have any questions, after this that either they think through after after we get off, if you want to just collect them and pass them off to me, I can make sure that we get those answered for them.
Perfect. And I think that you all are able to acquire the slides from this presentation. And if for whatever reason you cannot, if you'll just contact us, we'll be happy to provide that information to you. Once again, Beth Cook, Director of Customer Success at Resilinc, and that is the company's website. And Beth, once again, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us and educate us about supply chain risk management.
Yeah, thank
And
you
with
so
that,
much for having me.
and with that, we will end the webinar. You guys have a great day.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Same to
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.